Karoline Levitt stood on stage before a large crowd. Cameras flashed, smiles were fixed, and standard political slogans echoed across the hall. It was a routine appearance, designed to inspire confidence and hope among the voters. But in the midst of the orchestrated event, a voice shattered the calm. "Tito, I'm dying, help me," the voice cried out sharply. Karoline's eyes widened. She turned slowly to locate the source of the interruption. There, at the edge of the stage, stood a little girl. She was thin and frail, with earthy skin and dark circles under her eyes. Her eyes, enormous and pleading, captured the attention of everyone around. "What did you say?" Karoline demanded, her tone firm yet laced with concern. The girl repeated her words in a trembling voice. "They are refusing me treatment. We don't have insurance." The statement hung in the air like a loaded question. For a brief moment, silence reigned as the crowd tried to process the unexpected interruption. Journalists quickly redirected their cameras, their lenses zooming in on the unfolding drama. Karoline's gaze shifted to her guard. "Call an ambulance." Immediately, she ordered, her voice decisive. The urgency of the moment left no room for delay. The guard nodded briskly and stepped away to make the call. Karoline moved toward the girl without hesitation. She sat down beside the child and wrapped an arm around her skinny shoulders. "Where is your mother?" she asked, her voice softening as she tried to comfort the frightened child. The girl remained silent, lowering her head further as if weighed down by despair. The simple question sparked a realization in Karoline. She understood that this was not just an isolated incident. It was a glimpse into a larger, hidden crisis that had silently taken root in society. The girl's words echoed in her mind. There was no insurance. There was no one to fight for her. By the next morning, the video of the event exploded across the media. Headlines screamed of scandal and neglect. Social media lit up with outrage, and the public demanded answers. Karoline felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She knew that what had started as a simple interruption on stage was now a full-blown scandal with far-reaching implications. Throughout the day, journalists flooded her with questions. Was this a planned act? One reporter asked. Or a cry for help from a system gone wrong? Karoline struggled to find the right words. Each question added layers to the unfolding story, and every answer risked igniting further controversy. In a private moment, after the storm of questions had quieted, Karoline sat alone in her dressing room. Her thoughts raced. She had always believed in the power of political promises and public speeches. Yet now, faced with a child abandoned by a system that should have protected her, Karoline questioned everything. How could something so simple turn into a disaster? She wondered aloud. She realized that the crisis was much deeper than a mere policy debate. It was a personal tragedy, a failure of a system that had left its most vulnerable citizens to suffer. The image of the little girl's pleading eyes stayed with her, a silent accusation of neglect and indifference. Just as Karoline began to collect her thoughts, her phone buzzed with another alert. A breaking news update flashed on the screen, promising more revelations. Karoline knew that the day's events were only the beginning. By morning, everything would be different. In that moment, Karoline understood the stakes had grown higher. The scandal was only beginning, and tensions escalated. The next day, Karoline returned to the hospital with a determined look. The memory of the little girl's desperate plea burned in her mind. Her steps were brisk, and her resolve was unyielding. She needed answers. Inside the hospital corridor, Karoline found a doctor reviewing charts by the child's bedside. Without delay, she approached him. "Are they treating her?" she asked, her voice steadied despite the turmoil inside. The doctor sighed heavily. His eyes, filled with exhaustion, met hers as he explained. "She's in critical condition. But there's a problem." He gestured toward an empty chair next to the child's bed. His tone was measured, yet the message was clear. Karoline's brow furrowed. "How is that? The mother didn't come." The doctor nodded and replied. "We called her several times. She said she was busy." Karoline looked at the child lying motionless on the bed. The little girl was connected to several machines, her frail body barely sustaining the fight for life. She was thin, exhausted, and it was painfully obvious that she had been abandoned. The realization hit Karoline hard. The child was not only a victim of a failing system but also of her own mother's indifference. This was unacceptable. Determined to uncover the truth, Karoline decided she had to find this woman. The media had already begun to piece together the shocking narrative, and Karoline knew that every moment counted for the child's survival. With the address provided by investigative journalists, Karoline headed straight to the location. The building was old, the streets around it unkempt. When Karoline reached the door, she hesitated for just a second before knocking. The door creaked open to reveal a tired, indifferent woman. Her eyes were vacant, her posture slumped as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Karoline did not waste a moment. "Are you Sophie's mother?" she asked bluntly. The woman's reply was curt and immediate. "Yes." There was no warmth in her voice, no invitation to come inside. Instead, she stepped back and watched Karoline with a detached expression. Karoline pressed on, her voice rising with urgency. "Your daughter is in the ICU. Why aren't you with her?" The mother merely shrugged, a gesture that seemed to dismiss the gravity of the situation. "What can I do? We don't have insurance. We already tried. It's pointless." Anger flared in Karoline's eyes. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You weren't even with her. She's fighting for her life." Karoline's tone sharpened, the words laced with a mix of frustration and disbelief. The woman exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping even further as if the conversation drained her energy. "She's strong. She'll survive. And it's not, well, I'm not a doctor." Her voice was flat, devoid of any maternal concern. In that moment, Karoline felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. It wasn't just the harsh words, it was the cold resignation that the mother had displayed. This was a woman who had abandoned her child not out of malice, but out of indifference, a resignation born of despair and perhaps years of neglect. Karoline's mind raced. How could a mother be so detached? The system had failed the child, yes, but the neglect from someone who was meant to provide unconditional care cut even deeper. The truth was brutal. The little girl suffered not only because a broken system had left her without access to proper treatment, but also because her mother had long ago chosen to walk away from the fight. As Karoline stood there, the stark reality of the situation crystallized in her mind. The mother's words echoed in her ears, each one a bitter reminder of a society that had lost its way. "We don't have insurance," the mother had said. It was a cold statement of fact, but it also revealed a deeper truth about a community where even the most basic care was a luxury. The child was left to battle her illness alone long before the system had failed her. Karoline clenched her fists. The defiance in her eyes was unmistakable. She had seen too much to allow this injustice to continue. The media, the public, and the healthcare workers were beginning to react. The scandal was building, and Karoline was determined to bring every detail into the light. Back in the hospital, the monitors beeped steadily, a grim metronome to the child's fight for life. Nurses moved quickly, their faces set in expressions of professional concern as they adjusted the machines and administered treatments. Each beep of the machine reminded Karoline of the fragile line between life and death, a line that was drawn thinner by neglect and indifference. Karoline knew that finding the mother was just one step in exposing the systemic failures that had doomed so many vulnerable lives. She vowed to fight on, not only for the little girl, but for all those who were being overlooked by a system that valued profits over people. Her determination was clear in every word she spoke as she addressed the small crowd gathered outside the hospital later that day. "This isn't just about one child," she declared. "It's about a system that has failed its most vulnerable citizens. We must demand accountability, not just from our leaders, but from everyone who turns a blind eye to this suffering." Her words sparked murmurs of agreement and outrage. Journalists recorded her every word, knowing that this story was far from over. The scandal had only deepened, and Karoline's next steps would determine the future of a system teetering on the brink of collapse. As the day wore on, Karoline left the hospital with a heavy heart but a resolute spirit. The truth had been laid bare, and now, more than ever, she felt the urgent need for change. The stark images of the little girl, abandoned and fighting for life, burned in her memory. The scene was set. The stakes were higher than ever. The child's suffering was a damning indictment of a society that had long forgotten its duty to protect its own. And as Karoline drove away from the hospital, her mind raced with the next steps she would take to expose the indifference that had become all too common. She knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. Yet, as she navigated the darkening streets, a final thought crystallized in her mind. The little girl's struggle was not just about the system that failed her, it was also about a mother's abandonment, a wound that ran deeper than any policy could ever heal. The child had suffered not only because the system had left her to perish, but also because she had been alone long before she ever reached the hospital. The next day, the media exploded. Headlines flashed on every channel and online platform, fueling the fire of a scandal that had gripped the nation. Bold statements and incendiary questions dominated the news cycle. Karoline Levitt is using a sick child for publicity. She wants to give medical benefits to everyone indiscriminately. Doctors claim Levitt pressured the staff to secure a hospital bed. These questions swirled around like a vicious storm, each one adding another layer of controversy. Karoline listened in disbelief as news anchors repeated the accusations, their voices laced with skepticism and outrage. She knew the truth of the situation, yet the barrage of allegations was clearly designed to undermine her credibility and silence her fight for justice. Karoline realized that someone was trying to silence her. The narrative was being twisted and manipulated by powerful forces who feared the exposure of systemic failures. She had taken a stand for the little girl, for everyone who had been abandoned by a broken system. But now, with every new headline, it became painfully clear that her battle was about to grow even more perilous. The atmosphere was charged with tension as debates erupted across social media. Protesters and supporters clashed in heated online discussions, while small groups gathered outside the hospital demanding answers. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Karoline understood that the scandal was not just a political ploy, it was a calculated attempt to distract the public from the real issues plaguing the healthcare system. Fabricated stories and manipulated facts were being used to discredit her, to cast doubt on her intentions, and to obscure the truth. Amidst the media frenzy and public outrage, a sudden, more personal crisis struck. In the chaos, word spread that the little girl's condition had deteriorated dramatically. Hospital monitors beeped frantically as doctors rushed in, working urgently to stabilize her. Karoline was at the hospital when the call came in. The shock hit her like a tidal wave. This was the main blow. While the political and media battle raged outside, a deeper tragedy was unfolding inside the sterile walls of the intensive care unit. Karoline raced through the corridors, her heart pounding as she arrived at the ICU. Nurses and doctors were huddled around the child's bed, their expressions grave. One doctor turned to her, his voice tense. Her condition just worsened. We're doing everything we can, but she's slipping away. His words cut through Karoline like a knife, intensifying her resolve. In that moment, Karoline felt the full weight of the injustice. The little girl was not merely a pawn in a media war or a political scandal. She was a victim of a system that had abandoned her long before this crisis began. Every delay, every bureaucratic hurdle had contributed to her suffering. And now, as she stood by the child's bedside, Karoline vowed to fight even harder, not only to clear her own name but to expose the rotten foundations of a healthcare system in crisis. The media's relentless attack and the sudden turn in the child's condition converged into one overwhelming moment of truth. Karoline knew that her next steps would determine not only her future but also the fate of countless others who had been neglected. The storm was far from over, and every second counted in the battle for justice and accountability. Karoline stepped back from the intensive care unit, her resolve hardened by both media assaults and the heartbreaking deterioration of the child's health. She knew the battle had only begun. Karoline burst into the hospital, her heart pounding as she raced through the sterile corridors. The moment she reached the intensive care unit, panic took over. "What's wrong with her?" she cried out, her voice trembling with urgency and fear. Doctors and nurses had already gathered around the child's bed, their faces etched with concern and haste. In the midst of the controlled chaos, one of the senior physicians spoke sharply, "Cardiac arrest." His words echoed in the room, underscoring the gravity of the situation. Karoline stood in the doorway, frozen, unable to move as she absorbed the devastating news. The sight of the little girl, connected to a myriad of machines and fighting for every breath, was unbearable. In that moment, a stark and bitter truth struck her. This child was dying because of a system that had decided her life was worthless. The cold, unyielding bureaucracy had failed her, leaving her vulnerable and abandoned. The medical team immediately sprang into action. One nurse prepared the defibrillator while another called for backup. Shock. Another. No reaction, the devices indicated as the first attempts to revive the child fell short. Each shock delivered was met with silence from the failing heart, as if the machines themselves were pleading for a miracle that wouldn't come. Karoline's fists clenched tightly at her sides. Is that all? She thought, anger and sorrow mingling in her mind. Her body trembled, not just from fear but from a deep-seated rage at the injustice unfolding before her eyes. She had witnessed too many lives lost due to the indifference of a system that placed bureaucracy over humanity. Then, amid the beeping monitors and urgent commands, a faint, almost imperceptible sound broke through the tension, a weak signal on the monitor. It was a small sign, a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness of the situation. The doctor's eyes flickered to the screen, and without hesitation, he ordered, "Continue resuscitation." His voice was firm, carrying the weight of both professional duty and personal desperation. For several agonizing minutes, the team worked relentlessly. The atmosphere in the room shifted from despair to cautious determination as every possible measure was taken. Karoline's vision blurred with unshed tears as she watched the medical staff labor to restore the life that was slipping away. Every beep of the machine felt like a countdown to either hope or further heartbreak. At last, the doctor paused, scanning the room and the monitor with an expression that mixed relief with disbelief. "She's alive," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. The news hit Karoline like a surge of electricity, a momentary reprieve in an otherwise relentless storm of crisis. Overwhelmed by the cascade of emotions, Karoline covered her face with her hands, trying to hide the tears that streamed silently down her cheeks. Her heart ached, not only for the child whose life had been hanging by a thread, but also for the countless others caught in a system that valued protocol over compassion. Yet, even as she stood there, her mind was far from calm. The victory of a heartbeat restored was bittersweet. The fragile spark of life now flickered on the monitor, a reminder of both human resilience and systemic failure. Her thoughts churned with a grim realization: if nothing changed, next time she wouldn't have the chance to save a life at all. This wasn't just about one child. It was a glaring indictment of a system that treated lives as disposable commodities. In that charged moment, as the hospital staff resumed their frantic efforts to stabilize the child, Karoline made a silent vow. She would not let this be the norm. The stakes were too high, and the cost of inaction was measured in human lives. The room was filled with renewed determination as everyone worked against the clock, yet the underlying question remained, haunting her every thought. Karoline knew that this story would be suppressed at any cost. The evidence was too damning, too real to ignore. Determined to expose the injustice, she organized a press conference that would shake the very foundations of a broken system. The room buzzed with anticipation as reporters, cameras, and microphones were set up, all eager to capture the moment when Karoline would unveil the truth. Standing at the podium, Karoline's eyes scanned the crowd. There was no sign of fear in her expression, only steely resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "today I present you with evidence that our healthcare system has become a business of death. In our country, if you do not have insurance, you are condemned to suffer, to be ignored, and ultimately, to die." Her words cut through the air, resonating with every person present. With deliberate precision, Karoline laid out the evidence before the cameras. First, she displayed a series of documents that confirmed treatment had been denied to patients solely due to the absence of insurance. These documents prove that children, like the one you saw yesterday, were refused life-saving care, she declared, pointing to each piece of paper as if unveiling a criminal record. The camera flashes intensified, capturing every detail of her presentation. Next, Karoline revealed a list of names, children whose pleas for help had fallen on deaf ears. "These names represent the forgotten, the abandoned," she said. "They were not given a chance because of bureaucratic neglect." Each name on the list was a stark reminder of a system that had failed its most vulnerable citizens. Then, with a final dramatic flourish, she presented the correspondence between doctors. The emails and text messages were unequivocal. Orders had been given to refuse unwanted patients. "This is not just negligence," Karoline insisted, her voice rising with indignation. "This is a deliberate policy of exclusion that has cost lives." The room fell silent as she delivered her concluding statement. "We live in a country where if you do not have insurance, you are doomed. This isn't medicine, it's a business on deaths." The statement sent shockwaves through the audience, and for a moment, it felt as though the truth was too heavy to bear. The very next day, a political storm erupted. News outlets broadcasted breaking headlines around the clock. The president, facing mounting public pressure, announced an immediate overhaul of the healthcare system. In a stunning move, the Minister of Social Protection resigned, and a flurry of testimonies from doctors who had followed illegal orders began to emerge. The scandal had grown from a single tragic case to a full-blown national crisis. Karoline watched the unfolding events with mixed emotions, relief that her actions were catalyzing change, but also a deep-seated fear of the consequences. Just as the public began to demand accountability, her phone buzzed with a message that chilled her to the core. The text read, "You are warned. You made a mistake." The words seemed to echo the silent threat from that long-forgotten phone call, a call she had dismissed as nothing more than bureaucratic noise. Now, they carried the weight of an ominous warning. In that moment, Karoline felt the blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't merely a reprimand for her crusade against the system. It was a sign that there were darker forces at play, forces that would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. She recalled the call from several days earlier, a long, eerie silence on the other end that she had chosen to ignore. At the time, she had believed it was just another bureaucratic nuisance, but now she understood that it was a precursor to something far more sinister. The realization hit her hard. She was no longer just fighting a failing healthcare system. She was up against an organized network that was prepared to do whatever it took to silence her. In a moment of private reflection later that evening, Karoline sat alone in her study, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating stacks of documents and recorded interviews. Every piece of evidence she had gathered was a testament to the suffering of countless individuals. Yet, as she stared at the message on her phone, she wondered if her fight was about to cross a line from reform into rebellion, a line that could endanger not only her mission but her very life. The gravity of the situation was overwhelming. Karoline's thoughts raced as she considered the implications. The healthcare reform was underway, spurred by public outcry and undeniable proof of corruption and neglect. But now, with the warning message and the sinister memory of that ignored call, she realized that her crusade had attracted attention from more powerful and dangerous players. The stakes had risen dramatically. Determination welled up inside her. She knew that despite the threats, despite the blood running cold in her veins, she could not back down. The lives of those who had been left to suffer depended on her relentless pursuit of truth. The reform was only the beginning, a necessary first step toward dismantling a system that had devalued human life for too long. Karoline picked up her phone and began composing a new message, her fingers trembling with both fear and resolve. Every word she typed was a declaration that she would not be silenced, that she would continue to expose the truth no matter the cost. As she hit send, she felt a surge of adrenaline, a final act of defiance against the darkness that threatened to engulf her mission.